All right, let's talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the 34th president, and his time in office is one of these fascinating periods in American history. On the surface, you see peace and a booming economy, but just underneath, there were these incredible, simmering tensions. So we're going to dig into that legacy. So picture this. You take a five-star general, the guy who was the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, and you put him in the Oval Office. And you do it right at the absolute peak of the Cold War. The expectations? Sky high. The challenges? Even bigger. Talk about a high-stakes job, right?
You know, the thing is, to really get a handle on President Eisenhower, you have to start with General Eisenhower. His whole way of thinking, his approach to leading, it was all forged in the fires of World War II.
We're not talking about some career politician here. This was a man whose entire life was about discipline and organization. He's the guy who orchestrated the D-Day invasion, for crying out loud. He was known for being this incredibly calm, steady hand under pressure you and I can't even imagine. And that military background, it's going to shape every single thing he does as president.
So how did this military mindset translate into politics? Well, he had this philosophy he called modern republicanism. And it was really a balancing act. On one hand, he was a fiscal conservative, wanted to keep a really tight lid on government spending. But on the other hand, he was totally willing to back huge government programs if he thought they'd ultimately make the country stronger and help out the middle class.
And this philosophy wasn't just talk. It led directly to some of the most massive, tangible changes America has ever seen. We're talking about projects that literally reshaped the country.
Just look at that number. 48,000 miles of highway. This was the Interstate Highway System, the biggest public works project in the history of the United States. And for Ike, it wasn't just about making travel easier. It was a national defense issue. He saw it as a way to move troops and supplies anywhere in the country fast, if there was ever an emergency.
And you really can't overstate how much this changed everything. These highways didn't just connect cities, they totally rewired the American landscape. They sparked this huge economic boom, they basically invented the modern suburbs, and they changed the way Americans live and work forever.
And then, bam, 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. This tiny little satellite sends this massive shockwave of fear and anxiety across America. And Eisenhower's response was super fast and decisive. Just a year later, he creates NASA. And just like that, the space race was on.
But while all this was happening, building roads, creating NASA, the biggest, scariest challenge was always the Cold War. And his strategy here, well, it was a real mix of pragmatic and, frankly, terrifying.
He called it the New Look. The basic idea was to avoid paying for a gigantic, conventional army, which is incredibly expensive. His solution? Let's cut back on that and instead lean heavily on our growing nuclear arsenal as a deterrent. Sure, it was cheaper, but it also meant the stakes of any global conflict were raised to an absolutely unimaginable level.
And this really shows you the two sides of his foreign policy. Out in public, he was the peacemaker. He ended the Korean War, he held these big summits with the Soviets. But behind the curtain, a totally different story was playing out. He gave the CIA the green light to carry out secret operations to overthrow governments in places like Iran and Guatemala, actions that would have ripple effects for decades to come.
And eventually, that secret world blew up in his face. In 1960, a US U-2 spy plane gets shot down over the Soviet Union. The whole secret spy flight program was exposed, a huge peace summit with the Soviets completely collapsed, and suddenly Cold War tensions were ratcheted way, way up. It was a huge international embarrassment.
Meanwhile, back in the US, a completely different kind of battle was heating up, the struggle for civil rights. And this is probably one of the most complicated and debated parts of Eisenhower's entire legacy.
Now, he did take some really significant actions. He desegregated schools right there in Washington, D.C. His pick for Chief Justice, Earl Warren, would end up presiding over the historic Brown v. Board of Education case. And then, in 1957, he did something nobody had ever done. He sent the U.S. Army into Little Rock, Arkansas to protect 9 black students who were integrating a high school. Think about that. Federal troops sent to enforce desegregation.
But, and this is a big but, for all those actions, many civil rights leaders at the time were deeply frustrated. They saw him as way too cautious, too slow. He didn't come out and publicly support the Brown v. Board decision right away. And he often said privately that he didn't think you could really change people's hearts and minds just by passing laws.
So as his 2 terms came to an end, Eisenhower was getting ready to leave office with really high approval ratings, but in his final address to the nation, he delivered one last chilling warning.
I mean, just look at the scorecard he left behind. The economy was humming, we had the new highway system connecting the whole country, NASA was literally reaching for the stars, and he'd managed to keep us out of a catastrophic war. By almost every measure, he was a very popular, very effective president.
And then he steps up for his farewell address. And this 5-star general, the man who basically built up America's modern military, drops an absolute bombshell. He warns the American people about the growing power of something he coins a new term for, the military-industrial complex. He warned that its influence could become a disaster for democracy. Coming from him, of all people, it was just stunning.
So we're left with this really complex picture, right? A general who kept the peace, a fiscal conservative who launched these massive government projects, and a leader whose final act was to warn us about the very systems of power he commanded. And it leaves us with a big question we're all still grappling with. Was he just talking about his time, or is that warning more relevant today than ever before?